Welcome to the Catalyst Sale Podcast with Mike and Mike. Sales is a thinking process. This podcast will help you learn about what works in sales, how to hone your skills, and increase your success. I'm your host, Jody Mayberry, and am here with Mike Connor and Mike Simmons. Mike, we have a listener question this week. I know you love listener questions. This is from Keith in Michigan. So it's good to know you've got someone in Michigan tuning into the show here. But Keith is an engineer by trade, and he has listened to a couple of the shows, and he's curious about how you talk about sales being a thinking process, and he thinks some of the things that you say sound a lot like the Agile method they apply in engineering. So Keith is just curious, is this close? Can you be agile in sales?
It's kind of interesting. I think you can. I'm not a developer, not really big on the ones and zeros, and I know that's moved to actual coding. Played around with a couple of things, but when I've worked with folks on the product side and on the engineering side, as they've described the process, makes me think that sales was agile before the methodology really became in vogue. You know, as sales professionals, when we talk about sales being a thinking process, as sales professionals, we are constantly gathering information, applying that information to our process, and iterating. And you know, as people talk about the agile development process and 2-week sprints, I think you can look back and look at your sales cycles and look at those in the context of sprints. So I think Keith's onto something.
Well, I'm just amazed. We have an engineer now listening to our sales podcast, which is great because that's one of the things that we do is we bridge a lot of those gaps between product sales, engineering. In today's fast-moving environment, one of the byproducts of being an agile organization is having immediate feedback loops from your customers, and it does require a really unique dynamic between each of these groups. And so you don't just write with an old waterfall methodology where releases were a big deal. You'd gather requirements, you'd have customer meetings, you'd put together a laundry list of functionality for version 2.0. Document all of that, test the use cases, then you'd basically throw it over the wall, and then you would tell customers for the next 6 months that the next release is going to contain all of these features, only to find out that it would be delayed or that certain features would drop. And so the Agile methodology is actually very helpful from a sales perspective because it's a continuous feedback loop where iteration is made in shorter, Mike called them sprints. I mean, you can have a 1-week, 2-week sprint time frame where constantly you're seeing new things roll out in the product and you know what's on that horizon. But with that comes a responsibility where you have to collaborate a lot closer than maybe you had in the past.
And I think the importance of gathering that information over that period of time, it does a couple of things. One, it makes sure that you don't get too far off the rails when it comes to your plan. So as we start talking about applying guideposts to the sales process and path that we want to lead our clients along, taking this model and applying some rigor to it that has checkpoints that allow you to go back through and say, did we accomplish what we said we were going to accomplish? Has the data changed over that time period? Are there adjustments that we need to make? How do we apply those adjustments based on new information to our general plan and our general approach?
Right. So maybe a traditional sales process from years ago or what have you would be this build up to a close step. So say you have 4 or 5 steps. There's an introduction step, there's a get to know you step, a pitch step, and then you go on for the close. And I think what you'd see that would become similar to like that waterfall developer approach where you're building up to this event, which is now I've got a bag of tricks and gimmicks and things that I talk about to get my buyer to respond favorably. And I think we've, over time, and certainly through most of my sales career, have used a more iterative process, which is more of an agile methodology, which there is really no close step in the process, but there is a series of agreements that you gain as you're dealing with different business scenarios. And so the idea there is with those continuous feedback loops, with the engagement that you have with your clients, instead of having the grand closing step at the end of the process, you've actually got steps along the way that you want to gain agreement.
And I think what's neat about taking that approach is now you can look at different ways that you engage other members of the team. So now it doesn't become this thing that's going to happen in November of a given year that's 6 months out. It's constant engagement inside the organization so everybody is up to date with what's happening in the process, and there's not a lot of ambiguity on on where things sit, both with the customer and with the expectations that have been set inside. So as we talk about the different phases in our process and we get into that point of fit, and we're establishing, is this something that as we get into the stage that we've identified as fit, and we look at where we are in the process, this is where internally we're looking to see if we can make good on the expectations that we're setting with the client. It's kind of tough when you move along a process and you think that the organization is in the process of releasing a set of mobile apps in a given period of time. You've set an expectation with the customer that you're going to be able to meet good on that conversation. And then you find out a couple of weeks before the deal is moving forward or the deal is getting ready to close that there's been an adjustment internally on that time frame. And maybe a Windows app is no longer part of the equation, as an example. By having these stages, by taking this kind of approach, you can make sure that you're properly communicating expectations, not only with the customer, but also inside the organization.
Now, we've gone through in past episodes the steps of the catalyst sale process. Is agility built into those steps?
It really is. And agility from several different reasons. We talked already about this idea that you're gaining agreement and smaller agreements along the way as you kind of go on this journey with your buyer. But the other thing we do is we recognize when we engage the right people at the right time internally. So an agile process from a sales perspective for us means we don't invite our VP of product on every demo call so that they can show the product to our prospects. What we do is we move the process along to the point where it makes sense to engage that person if need be, to keep things moving forward efficiently, but also to respect the time of that individual that you're relying on to build the product. So part of it's knowing the steps of the process where you want to get it far along enough where you know that every time that you ask for those internal resources, it's the appropriate time and you're not going to burn a bunch of cycles with, wasted energy. So that would be one way where having those continuous feedback loops and acting in an agile way makes sure that you have the right people at the right time and letting them know what a pipeline looks like so that they can anticipate that. So one of the things that we do with the process when we're managing a pipeline of opportunities is we know what those requirements are going to be, and we can forecast what those time requirements are going to be for people that support us. And you'll always get a better outcome if you can predict that and have that scheduled way ahead of time instead of, hey, I've got a demo tomorrow. Is there a way you can hop on a phone call? There's definitely a better way to do that with more predictability.
Yeah, and think about the reputation you generate inside the organization when you're always you're the last minute demo person. It starts to pass on the impression that you're scattered, that you don't have a plan, that you're not managing a process. You're really just reacting to situations. Where in this process, by taking a more agile approach, you create space where you can be both proactive and then adjust and adapt or iterate based on the information that's given. And you get into situations like a customer demo. You're in a customer demo and you've got 10 minutes left in the discussion and you still haven't hit on the last 2 points that you want to address. You ask the customer if they have questions, and rather than going into answering those questions, you dive right back into the 2 things that were most important to you. Remember, there are opportunities to adapt and adjust and be agile in each of those meeting sessions. Take the time to listen to your customer. Take the time to hear what's important to them. Always validate that your understanding is correct. Confirm your agenda. Confirm your time period. Confirm that you've hit on each item. Pay attention to the clock.
Yeah, so I'll introduce a new concept here. There's agile and then there's super agile. And I'll give you an example of super agile. Super agile is when you are operating at breakneck speed and you invite somebody to come in and do a product demo and you haven't really prepped that person very well about the context. What are the goals of that call? Where are you in the process? What are the next steps? How is that person going to add value? I get those requests, and over time, our team has learned that when they ask for help, and we're all about giving help, so I don't want this to sound like we don't want to help our salespeople, but at the same time, they also know, here are the things I need to tell Mike or I so that we're prepared for that call and where we can add the most value possible. And I'll give you an example of super agile to me, and this happens periodically, is that you're on a group call or a demo call, and you've got the slideshow running as the showpiece, and you're sharing that, and then people have Slack open, and they Slack back and forth comments and suggestions and clarifications about where the client's guiding their questions, which is okay, but then that can become a distraction. My point being that doing just-in-time coaching on a demo call while you're on the call runs a lot of risk as far as being efficient and sounding distracted. And so that's probably going a little too far. And the idea is that you really want to be prepared and have everybody on the same page so that so they know where they can add value. It's better for everybody.
Well, and how many times have you been in that situation where whether you're giving the demo or you're watching the demo and you see somebody's email pop up, or you see somebody's Slack message pop up? So
or you hear the typing on the keyboard in the background, clickety, clickety, click.
You hear that. Just be where your customer is, be in the moment that you're working in, and shut the stuff off. There are times, demo is not the right place for this, but there are times where you want to have that immediate real-time collaboration. I think when we get into some of the negotiations that we get involved in, there's some value in having that kind of real-time access to thought and information and coaching. But you've also got to be aware of who you've got on the other end. And are they going to be able to handle that in the moment? What's their focus? So yeah, to Mike's point, like most things, you can take a good thing and make it really bad if you try to apply too much of it and try to get outside of your own process.
Simmons, earlier you had mentioned that Agile Sales helps you make sure you don't get too far off the rails. And I'm curious about that because it seems like having the ability to be agile could also send you in different directions. So can you speak to that a little bit on how being agile actually keeps you on track?
Yeah. So Jody, what's the old saying? Failure to plan is a plan to fail. So, on that note, you should always have your broader reaching plan, these guideposts that you've established on where you want to take the customer along this journey based on the experience you have and based on what you know about the customer. And then from that, you should have some kind of spectrum of comfort that allows you to deviate off that plan one way or another. That doesn't mean multiple 90-degree turns throughout the process. What that should be are slight iterations or slight movements, slight adjustments, your degrees of adjustments throughout the discussion based on new information. Let's say that early on in the process, you've established what their buying process is, and at no point in time did it come up that procurement was going to be involved. And then as you get into the later stages of the deal, you find out procurement is someone who needs to get involved. Using a process, adjusting to that new bit of information, incorporating it into your plan will allow you to kind of keep things moving ahead, keep things moving forward to the end goal, but not getting too far off where you're just pulled in a completely different direction. And I think of instances where you can be pulled in a completely different direction. Many times it's when new people are pulled into the sales discussion. And those people could be individuals who are part of your organization, or they could be part of the customer's organization. And you've got to, as they get involved, you've got to be really clear about what do they know about how things have moved along this path so far. What's their awareness of how we got here? So many times when Mike and I get engaged in these conversations or these discussions with our team, we get back to the basics. Who is the audience? What are we trying to do? Why are we trying to do it? How are we trying to do it? When are we trying to do it? And if we can't answer those simple questions, it becomes very difficult for Mike and I to help in that scenario. So I don't know, that was kind of a long roundabout way of getting to the core of your question, which is how does the agile process minimize risk that you get pulled too far off the track? And what it does is you yourself have to measure the slight adjustments that you're making. How do they compare to where you were ultimately taking the conversation or taking the discussion?
Another thing that, as I was listening to your response about that, Mike, was one of the other things I was thinking about were examples of where, to Jody's point, there's a difference between being off the rails and also being flexible and agile enough to be able to continue forward with a conversation. And the most basic example happened to us today on a meeting where we were listening in on a demo and a customer said, we've only got 10 minutes left in the call. I want to make sure that we cover off this item, which was important to the customer and to the buyer. And the response back was, okay, we have plenty of time. So there's a couple more things I want to show you, and then we'll get to that. And immediately I thought, boy, if somebody tells me this is what they want to talk about, that's where I go. So you can either be on the rails so tightly that you say, well, I'm going to get there, but just be patient with me because I know the path I want to take you down. Or you could be agile and say, okay, great. If that's important, I can come back to it later, but I want to get to the thing that I'm going to have their attention with and I'm going to have their engagement with. But another thing I was thinking about was in the context of Keith's original question and making the observation that agile methodology, which has become very popular, Eric Reyes wrote a book a few years ago about the lean startup, and it's really become a book that's become very popular and it has a whole practice around it. And it's a movement almost. And one of the things that I've noticed since that movement is the difference in dealing with companies that we work with that have either adopted that methodology or companies that haven't. And what I'm specifically talking about is companies that are, and maybe you're a salesperson in a company like this, where your company is really driven by an engineering mentality. So a decade ago or 2 decades ago, a lot of what happened inside of a company was driven by sales. And sales had a lot of influence on what was happening in a company and really set the direction for what was to be developed in product, how people were going to take things to market. They had a lot of influence. And a lot of these other areas were support areas that responded to sales. And what I've seen happen is a higher level of engagement and influence from the engineering and product side of companies. And I've seen it work really well, where there's a nice balance between sales, product, and engineering, where you can get together. There's a lot of trust. There's a common goal. We all realize we have differences in what we do, but we maintain a balance there, which is actually a really good thing, because if it's driven by sales, then sales might have the last thing they heard from one customer, and all of a sudden they make that their thing. And now they have their engineering team off building something that isn't going to be well accepted in the market. If the pendulum swings too far, and I've been in this situation as well, where engineering and product is running the show and telling you what you're going to get, and they don't deliver on things you ask for from clients and things like that. Point being, you can also swing in the other direction too far, where there's too much product and engineering focus, and it's being driven by that organization, and the sales department is all of a sudden kind of hanging out there to dry because they're not getting the feedback from the customers in play where it's making a difference. So I've been in each of those scenarios and then flavors in between with all of them. But where I've seen it work best is when you can realize where you have commonalities in being effective in your process, but maintaining that balance between those different areas. And if you can get to that point where you can work together very, very effectively, you'll find that your company will just churn out product enhancements, all those things at a pretty rapid rate.
I think what I heard there is trust becomes really important.
What final thoughts do you two have about this idea of agile sales?
I guess the way that I would kind of pull this together is say that you trust the fundamentals. Start with the customer. Make sure that you're constantly asking yourself, do I have all of the information I need? And am I applying it to where I am in the sales process? Don't come up with new or different ways to describe those foundational things. Whether you want to call it agile sales, or you want to call it iteration, or you want to call it adapting, or you want to call it whatever, it really comes down to taking what you know about the customer, taking what you know about your organization, putting your solution in the context of what's important to the customer, and really helping move them forward. I think you can apply a lot of these concepts, just like the sales concepts that we discussed. You can apply many of those to your daily work day, whether you're in sales or you're in consulting or you're in marketing or you're in HR or you're a journalist or you're in some other kind of role. But things don't necessarily have to have a label.
So I guess the last point that I would kind of touch on, and this is another example of something that I lived through recently, is understanding that I talked earlier about you working with other teams and really embracing some of the core tenets of being an agile company and an agile team, is that recognize that tools that you might use in your respective department don't necessarily have direct impact into the other organization. I'll give you an example. With my sales organization, we achieve a lot of our goals by using tools like our CRM system, some other things that have analytics and things that we can rely on to make sales decisions. But I'm now think of a past life where engineering did have an extreme focus on an influence on the organization, where tools that they were using to make themselves more effective, which were perfectly appropriate for engineering and product development really didn't have the ideal fit for how a salesperson was operating. And so one of the things that was implemented was a daily check-in, which was great for a remote engineering team that had to really on a daily basis know what people were writing code about and what they were working about. And they had a format where they would share an update every single day with the team. And that became a company-wide mantra where everybody in the company had to basically do a check-in every day. I already have salespeople living in CRM and I can get all of that information. I know what they're working on. So a rule of thumb, the thing I pushed back on was I said, this doesn't add value for sales teams. If I have sales reps filling out this daily activity report, now they're doing things that aren't adding value as a salesperson. And it took some time to understand how we could still deliver the information the CEO wanted through our own systems without having to incorporate another process that was really not adding any value for our team. And I remember it was a difficult conversation because at first it was like, no, we're all doing this. That's just the way it is. But be open to the fact that you can still have the same goals and work towards the same objectives. You don't necessarily have to have the exact same tools and methodology to achieve those goals.
Well, I want to thank Keith for sending in this question. It's always fun to bring listener questions forward to Mike and see where they go with it. If you have a question you would like Mike to answer on the show, you can just send an email to hello@catalystsale.com, or you can find Catalyst Sale on Twitter, which is not surprisingly @CatalystSale, or you can find us on LinkedIn. So thank you again, Mike for this great episode, and thank you for listening to the Catalyst Sale Podcast.